Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast, the series where I speak to people who can help us to understand the risks of human decision-making and what we can do to mitigate them. My guest on this episode, Tom Burgis, is an investigative journalist who writes for the Financial Times and who knows a thing or two about human risk. In 2015, Tom published his first book, The Looting Machine: Warlords, Tycoons, Smugglers and the Systematic Theft of Africa's Wealth. And he's just released a new book called Kleptopia: How Dirty Money is Conquering the World, in which he explores the astonishing world of kleptocracies, governments whose corrupt leaders use political power to appropriate the wealth of their nation, typically by embezzling or misappropriating government funds at the expense of the wider population. Not only does Tom expose what's going on in the countries where the kleptocracies exist, but he also looks at the way in which the activities impact and are supported by countries you wouldn't immediately associate with high levels of corruption, like the UK. It's an astonishing book, not least because, as we explore in our discussion, Tom's research into the subject started when he met Nigel Wilkins, a gentleman who had been a compliance officer in a Swiss bank and then joined the UK financial services regulator, the same path I took in my career, but in reverse. Where Tom's initial meeting with Nigel took him was on a global trail of money, power, injustice, cover-ups and criminality. If, like many of my listeners, you work in compliance, regulation, audit or legal, then much of what Tom has to say will resonate with you. You might not have come across the types of situation he exposes, but you'll recognize some of the underlying dynamics. And if you don't work in one of those fields, then this is still highly relevant to you, because the human risk that's inherent in Kleptopia is something that impacts every single one of us. And what makes Tom's book really engaging is that he tells the story through the lens of some of the people involved in it, from the most powerful to those with very little whose lives are nonetheless impacted by it. This is a phenomenal read. So I knew before recording this that the conversation with Tom would be stimulating and thought-provoking, which it really was. I know you're going to thoroughly enjoy my conversation with Tom Burgis on Kleptopia. Tom, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Hello, nice to join you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And look, I want to start by how you came to write your book. And it starts with a compliance officer who really forms the hero of your piece. And I'd be fascinated if you could share with my listeners how you came to meet him and sort of went on this journey to writing your book.
Yes, Nigel Wilkins is his name. I had been a foreign correspondent in Africa for a few years for the Financial Times. And then I came back and I moved back to London and spent a couple of years going to and fro various parts of Africa writing my previous book, The Looting Machine, which is about the oil and mining industries and how they foment corruption and violence across Africa. Excuse me. And when that book came out in 2015, I did various events to talk about it, as you do. And one night I was at the Frontline Club, which is the war correspondence club on a side street in Paddington, fantastic place. And we were talking about corruption and took questions, and it was quite packed out. And chap at the back put his hand up. He was wearing, as I remember, quite a kind of loud shirt and glasses, balding, sort of 50s. And he said, well, it's very interesting what you're talking about, all this corruption. I used to work in a Swiss bank, and I can tell you there was a lot of corruption in there. And I thought I could see my investigations editor at the time. I wasn't working as I am now, on the investigations team at the FT. Christine Spolar, amazing American journalist. I met her eye, and all four of our eyes bulged, and we thought we sort of, nodded at each other to say we better get that guy afterwards. Anyway, at the bar of the Frontline after this event, we had a drink with Nigel and got talking, and he said he'd worked for BSI, which had been, I think, about the 10th biggest Swiss bank, and he'd worked in its London office on Cheapside, just round the corner from the Bank of England. And we spoke a bit about that, and he didn't work there anymore. In fact, he'd gone on to work at the Financial Services Authority I think he worked for it during the phase when it changed from the FSA to the FCA. And anyway, we agreed to meet up, and Nigel and I started having lunch together in the Globe Theatre on the South Bank of the Thames. It's got a little restaurant in there, and that we would talk, and he started to tell his real story, which is not only had he worked in this bank, he'd been the compliance officer. And not only has he been the compliance officer, he'd started to have very serious suspicions that major money laundering and tax evasion was being abetted by this London office. And not only did he have those suspicions, he had acted on them. And he'd realised that the bankers in his office were so comfortable in their kind of shared endeavour that they would leave confidential paperwork lying around on their desks. And Nigel started to walk around the office after everyone had gone off to the airports and champagne bars and wherever else they went of an evening. Nigel, who was very much not a champagne bar kind of guy, he's Basingstoke, son of a guy who'd worked in an armaments factory and then been a lay preacher down in Basingstoke, down in Hampshire, sort of a little sort of unremarkable town. But Nigel did have this kind of congenital dislike of authority or distrust of authority. It's sort of been the big theme of his life. And here suddenly were the secrets of some of the most powerful people in the world lying around on various desks on Cheapside. So Nigel started to feeling a sort of quiver of fear, half knowing some of the names involved. He saw some sort of names connected to powerful Soviet people, powerful people in the Middle East and elsewhere. He just started to photocopy these documents and to take them home, bit by bit, on the tube down to Kensington, where he lived, in a fourth floor flat on his own. And he would put these files in these big red boxes, more and more in it. He had 1,000 pages by the weekend that Lehman Brothers collapsed. He was doing this in the teeth of the financial crisis, which is also the reason why BSI decided to close that office. Anyway, there's a long story that follows, but basically Nigel spent a long time trying to raise the alarm about what he'd discovered and realizing that the system that is meant to kick in when a compliance officer discovers what he reasonably believes to be money laundering around the corner from the Bank of England didn't kick in.
And so he then delivers you this kind of story, not quite on a platter, but it's kind of like it's enough for you to be going, I should look into this. This is fascinating.
Well, eventually he just gives me all those documents. I thought he gives me those 1,000 pages, and in a sense that is a story on a platter. But actually what happened was, initially I wrote a story in the Financial Times. It was called Dark Money, London's Dirty Secret, and it was about the techniques being used primarily. So it was about techniques that I'm sure you and your listeners have come across. You know, things like the use of front companies and dummy directors, offshore accounts, hold mail instructions, and so on. The things that were just at that moment, people were starting to realize that these are hallmarks of money laundering and tax evasion. So I wrote this story that sort of concentrated on those, and the story didn't really get anywhere. It was only when a few later years, and I couldn't tell a big part of the story, which I could ultimately tell in the book, which is what had happened to Nigel, which is that he had kept trying to raise the alarm, but the FSA and HMRC didn't appear to have done anything about it. The HMRC at least took some of the evidence. The FSA seemed to show no interest. And then he ended up working for the FSA, Nigel, years later. And he still had these red boxes sitting at home. And this is before I'd met him, so this is 2015. And one day he read in his Financial Times that the management of BSI, the Swiss bank where he used to work, the management of BSI had entered the US tax amnesty program. So you'll remember those huge cases where the US prosecutors went after UBS first and then Credit Suisse for abetting American tax evasion. And they basically said, right, to the rest of the Swiss banks, come in, we'll have an amnesty essentially of sorts. Come in, fess up, help us find the money that's been squirreled away and not paid in tax, and we will let you get off with a fine. And as if to make their point, they took Wegelin Bank and prosecuted it and killed it. So the rest of the Swiss banks thought to themselves, or the management thought to themselves, well, I'm probably going to do this, really, haven't we? And there in Nigel's newspaper was a statement from BSI, or it was reported that BSI was at the front of the queue and going to pay a few $100 million in a fine and confess to all sorts of shenanigans to hide money. And Nigel thought, well, that's what I said 7 years ago. I told the British authorities about this bank. So he went home from his job. He was working in the what's it called, the authorizations department of what was by then the FCA. This is 2015, and he'd already made quite a lot of fuss internally. He objected to the way that hedge funds were authorized with next to no oversight of their actual money. There was only oversight of their kind of management offices in London rather than the Cayman Islands vehicle into which God knows what was going. So, he was an awkward bastard, Nigel. That's who he was. And but an absolutely lovable one. And anyway, he went home, composed his thoughts. One thing he thought to himself was, well, hang on. Under the Proceeds of Crime Act, I, as the compliance officer, had a legal duty to report suspicions of money laundering. It didn't have to be that I was certain. I had that legal duty to report, and I did fulfill that duty. But if people in the UK now start investigating BSI, the person who's going to be on the hook for all this is me. I also have a legal obligation, as everybody does, not to destroy evidence of a crime. So it's a good job I kept all this stuff. So Nigel thought all this through, and he thought, well, actually, this is quite a relief. So now I can I'll just take the stuff to the FSA, to the FCA, to my bosses, to where I work now, and I'll give it to them, and there we go. They'll be able to see from my old letters and things that I did the right thing at the time. So anyway, he takes a selection. He takes like a couple of client lists and a couple of other documents from the 1,000 pages. He takes them into the office in Canary Wharf the next day, and he scans them and he emails them to his bosses. There's silence for about 36 hours or something, and then he gets a message saying, "Please come to a meeting." This is on a Friday. He goes to a meeting, and his boss and his boss's boss at the FCA sit him down and say, have you got, I'm paraphrasing now, just as a brief aside, the book is written like a non-fiction novel for literary reasons and for the reasons that we so often get lost in front companies and so on. And we have corporations in the newspaper every day saying things and wanting things and buying things. And they're not doing any of that. Human beings are doing all these things. So the book is written in the style of the novel that was sort of pioneered by Truman Capote in Cold Blood, but then obviously Michael Lewis writes brilliant novels like this and so on. So I've pieced together a lot of these scenes, and I've been able to do so because I've had access to extraordinary amounts of documents, and one of the things I had access to was the records of this meeting that happened at the FCA at Canary Wharf in 2015. So Nigel is summoned, and he's essentially told, why have you got this stuff? And he says, why have you got all this stuff? And he explains. And people start to ask him about why he's got it. And he said, well, I thought there was money laundering going on, and I was a compliance officer, and I had a duty, and I reported it, but then, I kept the evidence too, obviously. And they said, have you got any more? And he said, yeah, I've got more in my bag. And they said, no, we don't want to see any of that. And then someone goes out of the room, someone comes back into the room, it all gets a bit Kafkaesque at that point, and someone called Errol, as I recall, is summoned, who's a kind of Nigel's not allowed to have a union rep, but he's allowed Errol, whoever Errol is. And and then one of his bosses appears with a script and reads from this script, which essentially says, you have violated, I think they use the terrible term, customer confidentiality, as though and that was one of the things Nigel had always objected to, that the people in the financial sector were regarded as customers of the regulator. But I suppose also they're referring to the customers of BSI. customer confidentiality. You're not supposed to have any of this information. You've taken it illegally. You've broken all sorts of rules. You've put it on our systems. You are hereby suspended. And an investigation follows, and 3 months later, Nigel fights them, and he's fired for gross misconduct. Then he takes him to a tribunal, an employment tribunal, where there's a settlement, and he gets paid a bit of money. But the thing he really wanted was an acknowledgement that he hadn't done anything wrong. He had a sort of really strong moral impulse, Nigel, really strong conscience, and you can see that from his notebooks, his private notebooks, and so this weird dual reality exists whereby Nigel will continue to have been fired for gross misconduct in FCA land, but he's also given a reference saying what a great job he did while he was working for the FCA, and the FCA stipulates that it is not obliged to investigate what Nigel, the evidence Nigel alerted them to, and Nigel essentially remains banished from the city. He's flung out of the FCA, and he spent his life as an economist and then and in finance, and thought very deeply about it and its meanings, and it was kind of exiled, humiliated and exiled, marched from the building, humiliated and exiled, and that's how he spent his last years. I mean, he was pleased that he scored that partial victory, but still he never had that kind of vindication that some whistleblowers get.
And so the book is continuing what he began, if you like, on a much bigger scale, and it's almost sort of nice bit of serendipity that it plays into. You were talking about your the previous areas that you've looked at. It sort of plays into that space, because what then emerges from that story is I mean, I loved reading it, because I was literally flying, particularly at a time when we're not traveling. I found myself flying around the world, hearing stories of intrigue in all sorts of far-flung places, both in terms of where money comes from, but also then where it is taken to and where it's put and what that means. And you tell a whole host of different stories. And it's a fascinating tale, which if I sort of had to summarize it would be money is obtained by dubious and probably illegal and immoral means, and is then laundered through public systems in countries, particularly in the UK. And then that then takes us to the whole field of politics, the whole range of things. So it's you sort of taken this one individual, and out of that comes this incredible tale about how the world is run and how things that we think look civilized on the surface actually might be facilitating something that we really wouldn't want.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that you're quite right. I mean, there's several points there on there, but the book is essentially 4 stories. It's Nigel's story, and then it's the story of an oligarch from Central Asia who wants to build this kind of private empire that he lists on the London Stock Exchange. And then there's a kind of fraudster, money launderer, spy in Brooklyn with Russian heritage. And then there's a Canadian lawyer who gets entangled in a huge kleptocratic power struggle. And those 4 stories weave together. And the extraordinary thing I found was that, as you say, what Nigel found, serendipitously for me, did show a lot of these things I've been working on independently intersect. I came across ENRC, a lot of the books about the corporation ENRC at the heart of the biggest, certainly the most important corruption investigation in the UK still going. But I come across them in Congo, and then when I was in Africa, and then you can see the connections there to Zimbabwe, where I'd spent a lot of time too, and you could see connections to Mugabe's regime, and then you dig deeper into the past, and you can see Putin and the Kremlin in there, and the old the KGB money networks that came out of the end of the Soviet Union. Then you go into Kazakhstan, and you can see the connections between a massacre on the steppe and this kind of enormous PR machine trying to make the Kazakh dictator look legitimate. And from there, I followed more money trails, and you start to get into people who've been pumping money into Donald Trump before he was president, and these things will start to come together. And that's why I said earlier, that first story I wrote about Nigel really missed the point. I don't mind holding my hand up and saying I just didn't get far enough beyond the front companies. I mean, this stuff is meant to divert us, isn't it? The front companies and so on. It's meant to be bewildering and diverting. But I did eventually get beyond it, and it just struck me that a bit as with Mossack Fonseca, right? So there was, just that leak was one law firm in one country, admittedly a big one in the offshore system, but one law firm over one period of time in one country, and you've got 140 world leaders. It was the same with BSI. There were lots of people connected to ENRC, this kind of scandal-ridden, huge corporation, and people connected to other powerful elements in the former Soviet Union and in the Middle East. And that was just the stuff that Nigel found lying on some tables. And it makes you think about the sort of tip of the iceberg of all this. And, you can see, late on when I was working on the book, it took sort of 5 years and a lot of time traveling in Africa and traveling the former Soviet Union and meeting some seriously, what's the right word? Dodgy people.
Interesting.
Powerful, dangerous, rich people, and all those traveling and adventures and reporting, and you just start to see in the end, I hope, that I've spun it into what's meant to read like a kind of non-fiction novel, and that's where, and it comes. Yes, you're quite right. It all comes back to Nigel in the end. I think one of the things that really struck me about the whole story is how. And it's another mistake that we make when we're writing about this stuff, is we think it all happens in some other dimension. But actually, this global kleptocracy, by which I mean the rule of corruption, is penetrating deeper and deeper and deeper into our ordinary lives, I'd say. And that, so ordinary people who stumble upon these secrets are turning up dead now. And someone like Nigel, he can feel the sort of invisible resistance, the sort of sheer tonnage of secrecy around this world, bearing down on him, and that was one of the most striking things for me. How any of us could, I go looking for this stuff, but any of us could just step out the door the wrong way one day, and suddenly you're in this world.
It's fascinating when I look at it, because there's a sort of requirement to be seen to be honest. And so there's a huge image piece here. Now, some of that is to do with the fact that they want to retain power, and you need to do that. But there's a lot of, and particularly the London aspects of it, buying property here, acquiring legitimacy, it seems to me not just a key part of preserving money, because that's a sort of attempt to remove you away from where your ill-gotten gains came from and make you look respectable. But there is something human around. They want to be seen to be respectable people. And we can sort of see it with, whether it's Trump or anybody else, they want to be seen to be successful, legitimate business people who are trying to kind of shield it. So there's a recognition there that there is some part of this on the, needs them to not have the truth be told, not just for sort of financial and avoiding, I guess, going to prison, but also that seems to be part of it in terms of a human dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember interviewing once. I think they do need to see that, but it's also, I don't think they think it's, I think in some cases they think it's fake. I mean, no one ever thinks of them, very few people think of themselves as the bad guy. Right. That was something that really struck me in my African years. I mean, which are kind of still going, but when I was living out there. I remember I interviewed once Manuel Vicente, who, he's kind of Mr. Oil in Angola, which is the second biggest oil producer in Africa, as I'm sure you know. And, Manuel Vicente, I'd written the story. It's one of my first investigative stories when I got back to London, about how he and two kind of top securocrats in Angola, this very repressive regime, they had a secret stake in a company that had been made a partner of a kind of Texan oil company in an oil venture. Obviously, if you're in charge of the oil industry as a government official, you're not supposed to have private interest in it, especially not secret ones. You would have thought that would go without saying. Anyway, I'd written this story, and then I went back to Angola, and Vicente agreed to an interview, astonishingly. I think they had decided on a kind of that would be their tactic. And he was a big schmoozer. He has makes a big thing of speaking English and having relationships with all the big oil execs and that kind of thing. Anyway, he gave me his version of the story, which that he had been unaware of this secret stake. Make of that what you will. And but one of the other things, we got on to touching a bit more broadly, and in Angola, there's a presidential palace is up on I don't know if you've ever made it out to Luanda.
I haven't.
Amazing. I mean, one of the most expensive cities in the world. It's been completely distorted by oil, but also it's been completely shaped by the civil war there, and a huge influx of refugees from the interior to Luanda on the coast. So you have things like the the presidential compound, sort of Portuguese colonial era, white walls and fruit trees and that kind of thing. And then you have like 1 million people living on a rubbish dump next to it. And, I was saying to Vicente in this interview, how does it feel for you to be, a rich and powerful man and to be surrounded by really, really serious poverty? I mean, the poverty in Angola is bad. And Vicente, I'm paraphrasing, but Vicente says something like, "Oh, it breaks my heart. I'm a Christian man, and it makes me feel really bad." And I just thought, you've completely dissociated your role in this. But it didn't seem to me false. That it seemed genuine. That he could not see the fact that he was part of a profoundly corrupt regime, growing fat off the oil proceeds of the oil industry. He didn't see any connection between that and the fact that everyone else was mired in poverty. I mean, the sewage from the presidential compound literally runs down into people's houses. They are quite literally shitting on the rest of the population. And but for Vicente, that really, really struck me that, and I saw that again and again in the parts of Africa that have been most brutalized by corruption, places like the Niger Delta and Eastern Congo. And I don't see this goes for Vicente, excuse me, but at a poorer level, once kleptocracy really takes hold, there are no moral choices left. I was always struck by friends I had in the Niger Delta, which is, obviously the sort of the pre-militarized oil region of Nigeria, which was where I was living. I was living in Nigeria, and I would go down often there. It's these huge mangrove swamps, and a lot of oil being pumped by Shell and others for a long time, and a really brutal, sorry history of environmental devastation and violence, and profound corruption. And the people I'd know down there, who would be, trying to make a living driving a taxi or whatever, or running a bar, the psychology of that I always thought was so fascinating and so easily oversimplified. You wake up in the morning, what's your decision? What decisions are available? Someone demands you pay a bribe so you can get a license for your taxi. If you pay that bribe, you are perpetuating the corrupt system that is ruining your children's prospects. If you don't pay that bribe, you won't have a taxi and you won't have any money and your children won't have any food. There isn't an honest choice that a reasonable person could make. And that's one of the reasons to write this book, because it feels to me that kind of spirit of kleptocracy, the once it takes hold, it destroys the norms that separate economic power and political power. The norms that keep those things separate are, for me, the basis of democracy. We're incredibly lucky to be born in a time and place where it just so happens that those norms have taken hold. And once they start to break down, I did an event last night about crony contracting with COVID as a pretext, but these norms are being eroded, whether it be COVID contracting or whether it be Trump, who's, depended on kleptocratic money for many, many years before he became president and then essentially governed as a kleptocrat. These things all erode those norms and start to change the culture. And, regulatory culture is a crucial part of that, the psychology of regulators is so important. That's why I was so fascinated by what happened to Nigel, because his point was always essentially, look, if you have the banking industry paying for the regulators, then their interests are going to be ultimately aligned. And the financial regulators are so important because, and I think we completely miss this, and we often, we denigrate them, and we don't realize what an enormous public service is being done in financial regulation, and especially something like the Serious Fraud Office. These are our guard dogs against the erosion of the norms that preserve democracy. Anyway, that's an enormous tangent there, but I think I should probably stop talking now. But I've made a few points.
Incredibly powerful stuff, and I'm intrigued. And some of the bits I want to turn to. But as you're talking, I'm intrigued. How easy is it for you to unpick this stuff?
Oh no, it's horribly hard. Go on.
Because I was going to say, on the one hand, there's a hell of a lot of complexity that you've got to dive through, because these things are designed for you not to be able to instantly detect what's going on.
Right.
On the other hand, you seem to have quite a lot of people that are willing to speak. So I was sort of intrigued by that. I could imagine it's complex to dive through what the company structures and the sort of logistics of it. Mm-hmm. But from a practical perspective, people seem to be quite willing to talk to you, which I find really interesting.
Well, I'm not sure about willing, but yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and that's why I'm really interested to talk to you, because I think your approach is perfect. Like essentially, the key to all of this stuff is to get to the human beings, which may sound so obvious, but the whole system is set up to sort of dehumanify itself, isn't it? To transfer agency onto legal fictions, so onto a Cayman Islands company, and it creates plausible deniability for the human being involved. I mean, all the big corruption scandals of recent years, whatever it be, BAE, Halliburton, any of them, there is always a cutout legal entity, isn't there, which creates the legal deniability for the human beings involved. That's corruption is actually pretty simple. The way it's disguised is pretty simple. Often, I mean, like the central idea is simple, and then it's layered up with layer upon layer of bewildering complexity and secrecy. But your question about getting people to talk to me, so if you start from that point of saying, right, I'm going to write a book about what people are actually doing, and never is a company going to say something, and never is a company going to think something, and never is a legal entity that isn't a person going to do something. You take that, it's almost a linguistic starting point. As Orwell would tell us, that linguistic clarity is the key. And it's interesting. I found it interesting where you try to get to the human beings behind particularly barbaric uses of language. So, basically anything ever written in a market statement to the London Stock Exchange. But you start to think, why is it written like that? It's quite a good sort of red flag in a way. I'll come to your question about how I get people to talk to me, but the previous step is this whole idea of human agency. And there's one particular market statement, I think it's from April 2008, and it's like 1,000 pages of gobbledygook, put out by Camek, which was a London-listed mining company run by an ex-England cricketer and a kind of Rhodesian, and it was bewildering jargon and nonsense, and it features characters called things like Merryweather, an offshore company called Merryweather, which I was reminded the other day when my lovely little daughter was watching. Which one is it? Sleeping Beauty. Merryweather is one of the fairy. It's
literally a fairy tale. Right?
Literally a fairy tale. So Merryweather, straight out of Sleeping Beauty into this corporate statement. Merryweather does this, does that, the other, and then there's some other thing called some other name, and then and there are no human beings doing anything. And there's this loan agreement and that thing, the other thing. Translate that into actual reality, and what it is $100 million being paid to Robert Mugabe's regime just when it's about to embark on one of the most brutal election thefts of living memory in 2008. And in exchange, a platinum asset moves around, and as it happens, ends up a year later with my ENRC oligarchs. Another thing, this is an extraordinary example of what I'm talking about, these transnational kleptocratic networks, and not just alliances of those who have kleptocratic interests, Mohammed bin Salman, Putin, Xi, Trump, and so on, but actual interests. It's not just kind of a union of democracies, a union of kleptocracies. It's actual business connections, which are very hard to find, but I found a few of them in the book. Anyway, so once you push through to the human beings, you actually do find people a bit more willing to talk, because once you've pierced through to what people are actually doing, once you've got through the camouflage, it starts to make more sense, because you can start to see people doing things and acting in rational ways. Before you get that far, anyone can essentially tell you any story they want. That's the point of a front company, isn't it? You can write any story over the top of it. So there's people like Peter Salas, who's the Canadian lawyer in the book, whose client is Mukhtar Ablyazov, who, the Kazakh regime say he's a massive master criminal who's stolen billions, and Ablyazov and his people and one of the highest courts in France say he's actually a dissident, a persecuted dissident. Someone like Salas he was suspicious of me when I first got in contact with him, because I was looking at money that's gone from people around Ablyazov into Trump. And he had good reason to be suspicious, I'd later find out, and as I show in the book, because he was he had this extraordinary information or disinformation campaign and private intelligence operation descend on him and those around him. But eventually, once you cut through that and you start talking about what human beings are actually doing, the human beings who've been kidnapped and the human beings who've been tortured and so on, Peter gave me, hours upon hours upon hours of interviews. And you start to, especially, that was the advantage for me of trying to write a book like this, rather than a book of journalism, a book of narrative nonfiction. It's much, much harder and it took much, much longer. But also, there's something about having to write scenes that are dramatically plausible, as if they were in a novel, but which are true, but in which every detail is true and evidenced. There's a real discipline in that, and that you're not just trying to write a page for which you can offer some factual evidence. You're also trying to write a page that is dramatically plausible, whether it's a kidnapping scene in Rome or torture in Kazakhstan, or a dozen other scenes in the book all over the world, or the Trump's election night, whatever it may be. There's something about that is a great counterweight to the sort of dehumanization that financial secrecy is meant to create.
And it was, I mean, you're absolutely right. I found it. I actually ended up listening to the audiobook, which is read by you and is wonderful.
It's read by me, and I just, as a quick aside, I've had to veto my mother listening to that because, as you'll know, there's that one moment when I've got hold of a load of text messages in which a kind of black PR operative starts trying to intimidate Peter Salas with, let's say, salty language, and which I
remember that.
Yeah. Which I obviously had to read. I don't mind. I'm not squeamish, but my mum was threatening. She has read the book, which is one thing, but she was talking about wanting to listen to it. And I said, I don't think you should listen to that. I don't think you should hear your son saying all that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, I was listening to it when I went for a run. And I found myself a few times, but any excuse to stop running, obviously. But I found myself a few times just going, "Whoa, hold on a minute! I want to listen to that again," because actually, that's a really good example of where somebody's putting pressure on someone else, and it's blatant. It's it's couched in sort of, we'd like you to do that. I mean, it's very fruity language, as you say, and it's very clear what.
But it's also idiotic, right? The other thing we like that's, and this will have, the other thing that comes, I think that a mistake that's sometimes made in the portrayals of this world of kleptocrats is that everyone's a kind of, what's the term, like a spectre villain, and a streaky white cat and moving money around, and I mean there really are James Bond villain types out there, and some of them are in the book, and we are justified to be completely terrified of them and their power. But also in a world that is absolutely awash with dirty money, it attracts idiots as well, and it attracts people who it attracts chancers because there's no recourse, right? I mean, there's a lot of really stupid oligarchs out there, because they're people who were entrusted with money for one way or another, and there was no competition to select them, right? There was no market competition, just in the way there's no electoral competition. It's just like, okay, well, we'll go make our cousin, finance minister then. And but the economist Paul Collier calls this the survival of the fattest. And so if Nursultan Nazarbayev, the Kazakh dictator, decides, as he did, that he's going to go after this guy Ablyazov because he sees him as a rival because of the amount of money he has in a kleptocracy. So having a load of money, that makes him powerful. And we think he spent about at least $500 million on this campaign. $500 million, essentially putting up a flag saying, if you can come up with a plan to catch this guy, intimidate him, gloves are off, or whatever. You can have a piece of this pie. So all sorts of people. Okay, some of the people they hire are really serious ex-special forces and so on, and they're very effective at what they do at tracing assets and tracing people and so on. But also, you get these people like swaggering in who do fancy themselves as something out of a spy film, and they just do the most ridiculous, stupid things, like such as texting a load of abuse to a lawyer who is obviously just going to record those text messages, get them notarized, give them to a journalist. which is exactly what happened. So it's not that this is so if there is if there's a hope for the democracies, it may be, and I say this actually quite genuinely, that kleptocracies are very bad at selecting for merit. Democracies are, for all the problem of the kind of the lack of meritocracy, it's a lot better in a democracy. There are a lot more systems to promote talent because we all ultimately have an interest in talent being promoted in a democracy because they will steward all our interests. Whereas in a kleptocracy, obviously, it's the ruling cabal who are only out for their interest and to use appointments purely for patronage. So they're much worse at selecting people who will actually do a good job. I mean, there are very effective, brilliant people in the upper echelons of various kleptocracies, but kind of by mistake.
Right. It struck me reading it sort of on, as you say, I came through a thing going, well, there were loads of whoa moments. And then there were things where you kind of go, as you say, there's sort of buffoonery and kind of like, oh, that was a bit silly. Why did you do that? And that goes some way to explaining that piece. But as I look at sort of our attempts to stop these things, some of the structures that we have in place at the moment, the designs to deal with that actually either don't go far enough or in some respects facilitate what's there. So if you look at law and order as a good example, we have lots of rules that you need to comply with in order to keep the bad people from doing things. And yet, though, it's exactly those rules and structures that seem to facilitate some of these activities. So the City of London regulation being a really good example.
Yes. I mean, the difficulty is, isn't it? It seems to me that if you're going to summarize the UK's position, it is we ultimately want to attract all money, regardless of its origin, and also to project the image to the world that our financial system is clean and reliable. And the contradiction there, if it's a contradiction, or maybe those things are complementary, is that it is the very existence of the rule of law that makes the UK attractive to dirty money, because it's made in lawlessness and it seeks protection. And what you're starting to see more and more, it's been happening for a long time in the civil courts, is essentially kleptocratic power struggles that take place within criminal states. Kleptocracy is just political organized crime. It's just the privatization of power for private gain. And you see those struggles, and Nazarbayev versus Ablyazov is a great example, play out at massive expense, dominating a lot of court time. And the systems don't translate. You can't translate one into the other. So you have these kind of novel-length witness statements. They're amazing reads of Ablazov's submissions, and there's a dozen other cases like this or more going on right now. And British judges, because I'm still talking about the civil sectors, British judges are being asked by a large cast of ever-changing law firms, all making handsome fees out of this, to essentially to adjudicate feudal power struggles using the vocabulary of the rule of law. And of course, the decisions that come out of this is practically arbitrary, because everyone's a crook. That's the very definition of a kleptocracy. At the top of it, everybody is a crook. That's what they are. So that doesn't work. But what's, I'd say, even more troubling than that is, we've had 12 years of austerity. And before that, a couple of decades in which the idea of public service or of a kind of civic duty, had been on the wane, I guess, since the 80s, really, isn't it? Since kind of Thatcher and Reagan. And civic duty became a kind of naff idea, and the idea of public service was demeaned relative to these kind of veneration of money making, and that part of that was the kind of mad integration of gangster states like Russia into the capitalist system, and part of it was the kind of the mania for privatizing public services and so on. And these things tend to swing, don't they? Pendulum goes one way, then it goes about the other. But but you've had all of that, and then you had the financial crisis. So then you've had the institutions that are meant to police the market and enforce the norms of society on money making, have been first denigrated so that no one wants to go into them, and then massively cash starved. I mean, it seems to me that there's large parts of the political establishment that see doing down the serious fraud office, starving it of money, threatening to abolish it, sort of as like an advert for Britain, as a way of saying, it's a winking way of saying, don't worry, wherever your money comes from, if you've got enough of it, you'll be fine. And so now the result of that is, at the same time, the private intelligence industry has grown massively through outsourcing of intelligence work, and then through just the rise of this kind of global oligarchy. So out of Mayfair, particularly, but also Paris and Manhattan and whatnot, you have this extraordinary industry which is incredibly skillful, incredibly well-resourced, and working for paying clients. Now, put it to you, Christian, that if you're a hard-pushed recent, you're an idealistic recent graduate with a great brain and a great sense of public service, and you've taken a job at the SFO for a tenth of what you could have gone if you'd gone to Hogan Lovells or whatever, and you're working hard trying to make some corruption cases and to fight back against the global kleptocracy, which you can see encroaching on all you hold dear, and someone in an extremely expensive suit walks in one day and puts on your desk a 500-page evidence file and says, that oligarch is corrupt. Here's everything. We've had investigators on him for a year, everything, surveillance photos, we've got the money trails, we've got affidavits, the lot. There you go. Now, you go and you take up that case and you convict that oligarch, possibly even goes to jail in the UK, or certainly loses a lot of his assets, whatever it may be. Now, that oligarch deserved what he got because he was corrupt. The origins of his fortune were corrupt. But critically, he's been selected for prosecution because all the other oligarchs were corrupt too, but he's been picked out by his enemies. And back in wherever he came from, Azerbaijan, Congo, it doesn't matter, wherever it may be, Colombia, it is made known. This is going on now. People are doing this now. It is made known that, if you cross the machine, if you cross the regime, not only will we screw you at home, we can get you jailed in the UK. And then there's no buying your way out of that. Well, who knows? But, I mean, it's much harder to corrupt the system there. And, you can lose everything. And so it's the sort of the weaponization of the rule of law for kleptocratic purposes. And you saw that with the Trump presidency. Look at all the people around him. They're either in jail because he hasn't been able to bust it, because he fell out with them. The ones he fell out did some time. Others, he blocked them going to jail, or he's got them out of jail. He's now got the biggest question of all of how does he stop himself going to jail. But the law becomes completely political and becomes it becomes the kind of the locus of these kleptocratic power struggles, which are ultimately all about protecting your secrets and weaponizing your enemies. So you're entirely right, I think, to say, and this is something that I try to dramatize in the book, this kind of juxtaposition of people being tortured, people being murdered, and then the fights going on within the legal system, and how those two things are part of the same system.
I mean, it's fascinating. It's when you start to look at these things, it is, it's obvious this stuff is happening. I mean, as you say, there's some examples that are in the public eye in the US at the moment with some of these ludicrous court cases and other things that are going on, and we can start to see the dynamics you're talking about. And what you've done is shone a light on these things. I took some positive glimmer from you saying, well, they're not all as smart as they think they are. And the exposing what's going on, and the fact that you've written the book, I think, is tremendously helpful in this dynamic, because it makes more people aware of something that either they were turning a blind eye to, or they might not have been aware. But where do we go from here? How do we kind of solve this problem? Because I don't see it being it's not a great political thing to stand on, to say I'm going to deal with all these problems. It's not something that, particularly with COVID, it's not something that people are immediately drawn to as a high priority when they're voting.
Well, interesting you mentioned COVID. I'd say a couple of things. One is that I would obviously highly recommend people read my book. In fact, I recommend you buy 2 copies, right? Because there's lots of notes at the back, which are the ballast, which I've stripped out of the story, so the story rattles along, and in the back you've got the ballast. So probably best to get 2 copies, so you can have the notes, the notes and the text.
Love that
beside each other. And obviously it's an excellent stocking filler and so on. And but maybe more to the point, you're right that we're in the phase of trying to comprehend this, and I'd say Catherine Belton's Putin's People, a phenomenal book. She's not a colleague of mine and friend. Declare an interest, but that is a phenomenal book, also out this year, about this system of global kleptocracy. But she's got right to the heart of the Russian side of it. And then there are books like Nina Schick has written one called Deep Fakes, which starts to look at the other part of this. For me, you've got to see this sort of the rise of disinformation as part of the rise of kleptocracy, or connected to it. There's Oliver Bullow's book Moneyland, Misha Glenny's old classic, still utterly relevant, McMafia, and I could go on. Roberto Saviano's books about organised crime. There's lots of reading to be done, and then because I'd also say we're in that phase with this where maybe we were with climate change about 10 years ago, and I would say it's a similar. It needs to be up there on the list with these kind of like global threats to civilization. We used to think of climate change as a kind of esoteric scientific problem separate from our daily lives, and I think for a long time we've thought of kind of financial secrecy and kleptocracy and corruption in a similar way. But now, when you see witnesses to a British corruption case turning up dead, when you see when you see tales of torture being kind of spun for the media by former British prime ministers, when you see top spies in France secretly in the service of kleptocrats, when you see the man in the White House behaving like a kleptocrat, you start to see how far it's penetrated into the West, this kind of spirit of kleptocracy. And I'd also say, I'd say that's a similar sort of process to when we started to realize that climate change was changing our lives, that there'd be a wildfire near us, or a storm near us, or a refugee arriving in our country from Lake Chad, islands vanishing underwater, and so on. It's that shift of consciousness I think is starting to happen, which will lead to a real reappraisal of. It will lead us to realize that the spread of dirty money, it threatens those things that we hold most dear in our lives, and is not some kind of abstract problem.
Wow. I think that is a fantastic note on which to finish, because there's a point of optimism there. The book clearly comes super highly recommended. Feel free to plug it one more time. Remind people what it's called and who publishes it. It's
called Kleptopia, How Dirty Money is Conquering the World. It's out in the UK, the US. You can get it everywhere, basically, in English. And there's editions coming in German, Italian, Portuguese, maybe some other ones too. And yes, try and get it from your local independent bookshop, I would say.
Brilliant. Look, Tom, thank you so much for writing the book, because it really was a thoroughly enjoyable read and listen, and accompanied me on many miles of running. So that was a fabulous addition to an exercise that I don't always thoroughly enjoy. It really transformed that.
Good. I'm glad it did.
Thank you also for being on the podcast. It was supremely enlightening. There's some fascinating things for all of us to take away, and I know my listeners will have been intrigued and fascinated by it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. The one thing I'd say is, I have a wonderful and open-minded mother, but if you are giving the book to your mother, do warn her about the language.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Tom for appearing, and to you for listening. Now, in keeping with Tom's request to encourage you to buy Kleptopia from your local bookstore, I've put links in the show notes to Tom's books at bookshop.org, a virtual bookstore that allows those of you listening in the US and the UK to order your copy online while supporting your local independent bookstore. I've also put links to all the other books Tom mentioned during our discussion. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the podcasting platforms. If you like the show and had a chance to leave a 5-star review for it, that's hugely appreciated. It allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests and for other people to be able to find the show. It really does help. Now, in this festive period, I'm going to be releasing more episodes of the podcast than usual, so stay tuned on this frequency for another episode very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe, and thanks for listening.